Hi, this is Greg Kihlstrom. Welcome to the Agile World podcast, where we discuss customer experience, employee experience, and transformation in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to TEKsystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed on this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles or get a copy of my latest book, The Center of Experience, a blueprint for creating an experience-led organization, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kihlstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. I'm excited to introduce part one of a special three-part series about content and CX, brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. Today, we're going to talk about how content supports business outcomes, the critical importance of a content strategy in CX, and data's role in a content strategy. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Steve Householder and returning Agile World guest, Burk Buechler from TEKsystems Digital Experience team. First, why don't you both tell me a little bit about your background and what you do at TEKsystems?
Hey, great. Thanks, Greg. This is Steve. It's great to be here. I have been with TEKsystems now for 20 plus years, going on to my 22nd year, to be precise. Held several different posts in the organization, both inside and outside the United States. The last 3 years, I've been looking after our digital and creative division, heading that up. We focus on delighting the customer through multiple services, whether they be talent, outcome-based engagements, and certainly look forward to this discussion and diving deeper into the subject matter. And thanks for having me.
Great.
Yeah, and hey, Greg, Burk Buechler here. Great to talk to you again. Happy to be a part of this podcast. So I lead all of TEKsystems digital delivery and practice globally, based out of Austin, Texas, and been with Tech about 2 years now, and we're building just some terrific momentum in this space, and happy to be here.
Great. Well, it's great to have you both on the show. Thanks for being here. Let's start by talking about how content fits into business objectives. So first question, how do organizations align their content to business goals?
Yeah, so Greg, what I would say is digital and content particularly flows through every aspect of a business. It's the piece of your marketing plan that demonstrates, who you are, the expertise you bring to the table, your industry. We see content going hand in hand with things like information architecture, which is the organizing framework that makes it as easy as possible for customers and users to be able to consume the content. And so as it aligns to business goals, it's key that, organizations have, number one, a good handle on those goals, and then aligning the specific content to that.
Yeah, that's great, Burk. Just a quick add-on to that, Greg. When I think about aligning content to business goals, I think of really clearly doing three things. If I could just distill it down to three critical things. Number one is attracting customers. Number two would be deepening the relationship with existing customers. And number three would be that ability to retain customers that are potentially at risk of leaving. So when I think about each an element of each one of those, certainly when you think about attracting, you're wanting to know your audience better. You're wanting to know that really at empathy level, what they're thinking about. Number two, when we talk about that deepening, it's optimizing for voice. Certainly there is a huge voice component that marketers and businesses need to be aware of that can really enhance and or deepen that relationship with customers that they already have. And when you think about that retention, certainly identifying the right platforms that allow you to scale and reach the audiences that you want to. And then there's this big push in, we'll call it user-generated content, content that is created by the organization, by their users, that is shareable. And that those are key elements that I think about when I think about content related to the strategy.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, quite a few things in that, in there. So who should be responsible for the organization's content strategy?
I think we find it most all, Greg, is owned by the marketing department. The typical customers that we work with on, let's say, the medium to large organization side likely will have a dedicated team or role for those types of functions, but it's always under the purview of marketing.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that you also need to consider, in the product-driven organization, the folks that understand at a really deep level, the product that they're trying to launch, whether it's a new audience or they're trying to scale in an already existing audience. Those folks should be brought into the decision-making process for sure, if not definitely the influencing process.
Yeah. Where do you see the customer experience? So there's CXOs popping up in at companies and things like that. So where do you see CXOs relating to the marketing team and content strategy and everything like that?
So I think CXOs are taking a very direct experience in this area because oftentimes they're driven by maximizing the customer experience. They're responsible for outstanding customer experience throughout the organization. And in particular, as it relates to content, that's a key area that's going to drive that interaction with the brand and with the business. And so they'll take an outsized role in making sure that's done correctly.
Yeah, it's it's an interesting one. This chief customer officer, this chief journey officer, this obsessive person inside the organization is an interesting role, and there's a lot of really cool things about it, but there's a lot of really gnarly things about it too. And I think what you're going to see in 2020 and 21, Greg, is I think you're going to see the CXOs or the customer obsessive leaders that are able to actually show a tangible return on the investment are going to be the ones that thrive. Yeah. The ones that can't show meaningful returns on a lot of the creative initiatives that they're launching and they're endeavoring or have been endeavoring to launch for the last couple of years, they're just simply not going to be there. What I know is that I talked to several CMOs and CEOs, and I know that the tolerance level for talking about customer experience is over.
Yeah.
The reality is, show me the money in a kind of Jerry Maguire type style. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the patience is wearing thin.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic that plays out.
Yeah. I mean, there is to your point, there is definitely an increasing emphasis on, we all kind of know the numbers that customer experience is important and all of those things, but there is definitely an increasing emphasis on ROI and things like that. So how does that content strategy or content strategist or the content they produce, how does that shape or help shape the customer experience?
So I'll take this one on. So how content shapes the customer experience. When I think about that, I think about knowing the buyer journey. Okay, so most organizations have mapped the buyer journey. They know there's 20 touch points to it. They know where to win and lose or where they won and lost. And layering in the right content to the right audience at the right time, absolutely critical. So if organizations that are listening to this podcast feel great about their the level of work that they've done to map the buyer journey and they know the touch points, then layering in the content that speaks to that audience in the most meaningful way at the right time usually will produce the result that they're looking for. I mean, think about it. 90% of buyer purchases are made before the purchase is actually made.
Yeah.
Right? So we turn to Google, we turn to Bing, we look at the analytics that come from those searches, and we map that journey, and then we layer in our content with our strategy to hit them, whether it's voice, whether it's blogs or digital. That's really, I think, the key.
How can customer experience be improved through use of content, maybe even after the sale and things like that? You mentioned a few ways to educate, but what are some other ways that the CX can be improved through content?
Well, I think in terms of after the sale, that gets to personalization, right? Because you have to have a relationship established with your target audiences to make sure that as you interact with them before the purchase, and after the purchase, they have a similar quality of interaction with that brand. Now we'll talk about it probably later in the podcast, but we'll get into analytics and how that helps serve that. But certainly the analytics piece will help determine how you interact in the most effective way, both before the sale and after the sale.
Yeah, for sure. And I think so when I think content marketing, I think the art of persuading people through education, right? Make me smarter, make me more informed, give me some information that I don't know about a product or about your brand, right? So if I think that doesn't stop after the purchase, or it shouldn't stop after the purchase, if you can continue to embrace a relationship with me where you're continuing to educate me and work with me on making me aware of new versions or new features that you have added to your product or your service, gold star.
Yeah. Are there any types of content that you feel can be used more effectively, or maybe underrated, or things like that?
Oh man, 1,000%. I mean, 1,000%. I mean, I think some organizations you do it really well, and I know we're going to get into that later in the podcast. Huge fan of Red Bull and what they've been able to do. But look, voice and video to me are just key. And maybe it's just because that's how I learn better. But voice and video, and you can kind of just see the personality that comes through in those things. Dude, that's it, man. That's where it's at. If marketers can really embrace their audiences through voice and video, I think that you're gonna definitely be happy with results.
Yeah. So Burk, you briefly mentioned analytics, and so let's talk a little bit more about that now. So data and measurement. What's the role of data in the content strategy?
Yeah, great question, Greg. It absolutely has a critical role. When we think about web analytics data, helping to identify the target audience, which is going to be the start of any good content strategy, is really defining that audience, defining the personas of who you want to connect to and what their preferences are. Web analytics also helps with trending topics. You can look at channel-specific preferences of potential customers that you're trying to target, and as well as when you bring in areas like social media, what are the influencers most relevant to your stakeholders and group that you're trying to hit? So all of data can serve all those areas and give you the best insight into how to act.
1,000%, Burk. I mean, you hit the nail on the head, and I know we're going to get into some of the challenges a little bit later on. The ability for an organization to democratize the data across the enterprise is critical, right? I mean, technology is going to give you the access to the data, but the ability to share it and put it to meaningful use across the enterprise, absolutely critical. So I know we're going to get into the challenges later, but I just thought that was relevant to say.
Well, actually, if you could talk a little bit more about what are some of the ways that it can be used across the organization, just from a data or metrics standpoint as well.
Well, I think as we talked about, you want to use web analytics data as a starting point, but the key with data is really to think about it holistically, right? So remember that the end user, the person you're trying to target, doesn't know that they're interacting with a multitude of systems on the back end of your company. Yeah. And so as you think about that buyer journey, you want to make it as easy and simple as possible for them to get to the information that they need to make that decision on interaction, brand, purchase, whatever it may be. And so all those metrics are going to be a reflection of whether or not that customer experience and content strategy is being effective.
Great. Well, Burk and Steve, thanks so much for joining part one of 3 of this show. For those listening, what's the best way to keep up with what you and TEKsystems Digital are doing in the area of content and content strategy?
Yeah, so I'd encourage everyone listening to just go to TEKsystems.com /next now on our website, particularly related to digital, and you'll find all the information that we've been producing and posting to that location.
Great. If you'd like to hear more from Burk and Steve, tune into parts 2 and 3 of this podcast series about content and CX, continuing over the next 2 weeks. Again, I'd like to thank Burk, Buechler, and Steve Householder from TEKsystems Digital for joining the show. If you'd like to hear more from Burk and Steve, tune into parts 2 and 3 of this podcast series about content and CX, continuing over the next 2 weeks. Again, I'd like to thank Burk, Buechler, and Steve Householder from TEKsystems Digital for joining the show. You can learn more about content strategy and tech systems at TEKsystems.com. Thanks for listening to The Agile World with Greg Kihlstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by TEKsystems. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Center of Experience, from my website at theagile.world or on Amazon or other retailers. Until next week, stay agile.